Bruno Le Maire, thank you so much for joining us. You are France's longest-serving finance minister. You were at the G7 in 2019, and you know exactly how this machine works. I want to ask you to kick off. There is a joint declaration. It was not clear that there would be one, but there is a joint declaration, certainly on Ukraine. What do you make of it?
I think that the final declaration of the G7 countries is a very strong and a very good one. All the points that we have on Ukraine are really significant and show a full support of G7 countries to Ukraine and to the opposition to the Russian attack. The fact that G7 countries seem to be able and ready to provide long-range missiles to Ukraine is quite good news. The fact that the United States of America stand ready to trigger new economic sanctions against Russia is also good news to put that war to an end, to a ceasefire, and to really put a limit to Vladimir Putin. I also think that on the global imbalances, France and President Macron were right to underline that these global imbalances between the US, Europe, and China are not for the benefit of all the countries in the world and must be changed.
I don't want to spend too much time on President Trump, but he is going to a dinner in Versailles. Was that a step needed in terms of diplomacy to get this deal done?
You know, we all are aware of the difficulties that we are facing in the relationship between Europe and the US. I was personally very critical against the deal that was made between the United States and Iran, because to me this is a fake deal. But I think that this is in the global interest of all G7 members to stand united to face the challenges of the 21st century, especially the question of economic imbalances with China.
And you say this is a fake deal. Why is that? The Europeans have welcomed that as a breakthrough. In fact, they salute, and that's a quote, the strong leadership of the president of the U.S. Is this really a good deal?
No, it's not a good deal. And I disagree on that point. I would use the title of a famous play, which is Much Ado About Nothing. The United States decided to trigger the war against Iran. And I think that after the deal, Iran is stronger than before the war. You still have these uncertainties about the future of the Strait of Hormuz. Will there be a toll or not on the Strait of Hormuz? You don't have very strong solutions, and you are not addressing the key question of fissile materials. There are only words, but there are not very strong technical commitments on the fissile materials and on the best way to prevent Iran to get access to the nuclear weapon, which is the absolute key and the absolute worry of all countries around the world. How do we do to prevent Iran to get access to the nuclear weapon? And the third question, which is not addressed in the deal, is the long-range ballistic missiles capacities of Iran. You know that the southern part of Europe could be hit at some point by those missiles. Not addressing the threat posed by the Iranian missiles is, to me, a mistake and could be a threat on the long term.
So did the Europeans make a mistake by basically endorsing that deal in the statement?
Well, having a deal is always better to have a war. But we must be lucid that this month of war have reinforced the Iranian regime and reinforced Iran in the region. It was not exactly the strategic purpose of that war. So to me, this is a failure. And I think that the European countries do have a key role to play to reinforce the commitment of Iran vis-à-vis the nuclear weapons, vis-à-vis the missile threat, and also vis-à-vis the key question from an economic point of view of the Strait of Hormuz.
And Mr. Le Maire, in a broader line, you have said at times that the way that Trump negotiates, and you've seen it firsthand because you were involved directly in those talks, is sometimes and oftentimes brutal. Is this G7 a moment of reconciliation, or would you say ultimately Trump has not changed? The Europeans need to push for their own interests?
I think that the single lesson that all the European leaders must draw from the past month, and I would say from the past 2 years, is that if they want to be relevant and strong, they need to be united. And they don't need to be united with the 27 member states. They need to give a new impetus to the European construction by building a European with 6 core countries: France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland, and the Netherlands. They should put on the table some key issues on which they want to deliver, either the question of Iran, or the question of Ukraine, or the question of building chips capacities on the European soil, or the question of energy and nuclear energy. 6 countries instead of 27 countries is the best way of reinforcing Europe, of facing the threat posed by many empires around the world, and to get some concrete results. You know, we cannot accept anymore to be blackmailed by the US administration. The way President Trump and the US administration is explaining, well, you should get rid of the taxation of Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft, otherwise I will hit you with new tariffs, is 100% unacceptable among allies. So if we want to resist that kind of threat and that kind of blackmail, we need to be united. The 6 strongest European member states must stand united.
So you're saying that blackmail will remain, but you make a strong statement there. You say Europe, forget about unity at 27, go to 6 countries. How would that work?
You know, 27 countries means long talks and very few decisions. We need strong decisions and less talks. This is why I really emphasize the necessity to move towards a Europe with 6 core countries, and then the 21 other member states, if they want to join, they will join. But first of all, let's move on. Second, the way the US are dealing with Europe is not acceptable. The way they are putting this question of tariffs and this threat of new tariffs against French wines or German automobile industry is something we cannot accept. But if we are divided, you cannot resist that pressure. If you stand united, explaining that it will be difficult for the US to get access to the European market if they do not respect Europe as a partner, is the best way of getting some concrete results.
And I want to ask you a final question, but I want to pick up on this point because you're pitching now a Europe that would work at 6. Is there political consensus to do that? And I say that because your own country is heading into a very polarizing election next year.
Next year you will have key elections. So I think it's time, 11 months before the national elections in France, to clearly explain to the French people what we want for the future of Europe. Either we stand with a decision-making process with 27 member states, the Commission, we do not really know who is responsible for what. And you cannot get results on key issues like artificial intelligence, the cloud capacities, and the production of semiconductors on the European soil, just to speak about tech. Or you explain to the French people, well, we want to come back to a Europe which is a core Europe with 6 key countries that will be able to deliver concretely on some very specific topics. And you will give the sense that Europe can be efficient, that Europe can deliver, that you can get some concrete results, and that standing united, you have the possibility of bridging the gap with China, bridging the gap with the US, and resisting the pressure of those countries. This is why I really think that it's time to radically change the way Europe has been constructed.
And sir, just as a final point, you mentioned economic imbalances. That is a code now for clearly China. The way things are going, it seems to me a trade war between the EU and China is inevitable and maybe even necessary. How do you deal with a power like China?
Well, of course, we should avoid any kind of trade war with China. But we must be respected by the Chinese government and by President Xi Jinping, which means that you must explain to China, being once again united, the 6 key countries, that China cannot get access to the single market without taking some decisions and without abiding by rules. The first one is that if there has been some heavy public subsidies to 1 or 2 sectors, like the automotive industry, China will have to pay to sell its cars on the European soil and in the single market. Second, we must put in place a rule of European content. And a real rule of European content, not the one extended to 90 other countries, but a rule of European content limited to the single market and to the European producers. Third, we need a transfer of technologies. And we need to explain to our Chinese partner that it is time for us to get access to some technologies that we urgently need to improve our productivity and our competitiveness. In the field of batteries, for instance, electric batteries, we need the technologies of China and we need the cooperation of China. So the deal would be you can get access to the European single market with the 450 million consumers, but under some conditions. European content, transfer of technologies, and tariffs in the case a sector has been heavily subsidized by the Chinese government. This is what I would call a new level playing field between China and Europe. A very last point, but which is absolutely key, that must be addressed at the level of the G7 with the United States, Europe, and all the Western countries, is the fact that the Chinese currency is underestimated and underrated. This poses huge problem for the competitiveness of the European and the US industry. So we must address this question of the level of the Chinese currency and the fact that for the time being it is under-evaluated and it gives to China the possibility of exporting far quicker and far better its products to either the US or to Europe.
So a new level playing field. Mr. Le Maire, thank you so much for joining us on this important G7.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.